Okay, welcome back after the short but very helpful break. So we have now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ludo Waltman. Ludo is a professor of quantitative science studies and deputy director at the Center for Science and Technology Studies, CWTS, at Leiden University. Ludo leads the Quantitative Science Studies QSS research group at the institution with a special emphasis on applications, research management, and science policy. Ludo co-develops two software tools for the analysis of visualization and analysis of bibliometric networks, VOS Viewer and SiteNet Explorer. He is also the coordinator of CWTS Leiden Ranking, a bibliometric ranking of major universities worldwide. In addition, he serves as the editor-in-chief of the Journal Quantitative Science Studies. Please join me in welcoming Ludo to the summer school and to the mentoring session later on and the panel later on. So Ludo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel. It's really great to be here today. Glad to see you all. And what I will do is I will do a quick presentation about some of my thinking about how our publishing system work. So I will share my screen. So this presentation is about improving scientific publishing, and also the argument that I will make, the argument that we should, as science of science researchers, we should lead by example. I will get back to that at the end. I should start by saying a few things about what might perhaps be seen as a competing interest in the context of this presentation. So Daniel already mentioned my affiliation with the Center for Science and Technology Studies, CWTS, at Leiden University, and also my role as the editor-in-chief of the journal Quantitative Science Studies. I'm mentioning it as a potential competing interest because I will actually, in this talk, I will reflect on the way we do scientific publishing in general, but in particular in the science of science community. And I will say things about journals in our community, journals that we tend to publish in, and perhaps strengths and weaknesses of different journals. And from that point of view, I may be perceived to have a competing interest. You can also see some other things on this slide that I do, like this initiative for open abstracts, publish your reviews. These are all initiatives that are about improving the way scientific publishing is done. And I will get back to that later on. Basically, in this presentation, I have three questions that I would like to address. Time is limited, so I will definitely not give exhaustive answers to these complex questions, but I will try to give you kind of a flavor of my own thinking about these questions, also my own kind of experience that I have gained over the years in thinking about these three questions, and definitely my own thinking has evolved as a result of all that experience. So the first question is, what does the science of science community know about the scientific publishing system? So that's basically just how we as a community, science of science, or sometimes I use the term research on research, how we have studied the scientific publishing system, or some people say the scholarly communication system. So what do we know about it? What are the issues that we care about, that we study, that we perhaps disagree about? I will definitely not give an exhaustive summary, but I will highlight some of the things that are being discussed and being studied, with a particular emphasis on issues related to open science, and also the issue of prestige. Second, how does the science of science community, how does our community, how do we organize publishing of our own work? So this is, I want to start reflecting also on what we do ourselves. We are not just studying the research system, the science system, but we're also, of course, part of the system. And in that sense, we are in a kind of special position, being both researchers studying how science is done, while at the same time also doing it ourselves and also publishing ourselves. So what do we do in our own approach to scientific publishing? And third, as members, each of us, all of you and myself, as members of the science of science community, I will also raise the question how we ourselves, each of us, how we can contribute to improving the scientific publishing system. And that goes back to this idea of leading by example. Okay, I'm going to discuss a number of developments related to scientific publishing, and in particular, as I already mentioned, related to this development that is sometimes called open science. So all these things related to open access publishing, preprinting, data sharing, all these types of things. I will study some of the research that has been done. I will discuss some of the research that has been done, but I will also at the same time reflect on the actual practices of our own journals, the journals that we tend to publish in. And I will look, and you can see it here already on this slide, I will look both at kind of journals that are specific for our field of research, for science of science, for research on research, or perhaps for the subfield of scientometrics, the field that I'm most familiar with myself. So I will focus on these journals. I will also at the same time focus on other journals, journals that are in particular well known because of their prestige. So I'm going to look at both types of journals. And I will start by discussing the issue of open access. The first thing I'm going to discuss is gold open access, which, as you may be aware, is open access to the final version of an article that is published in a journal. And that version is typically called the version of record. So there's a lot of literature on open access, a lot of research by people that do science of science or scientometrics or they study scholarly communication. We all have, of course, our own labels, but ultimately everyone is studying open access in all kinds of ways. So you see here a selection of papers on this topic. So we see a paper about open access policies of journals. We see a paper about measuring how much research is open access. We see a paper about policies of research institutions to promote open access and the impact of these policies. We see the possibility that open access might lead to more citation impact. So that's often called the citation advantage of open access publishing. We see also discussions about preprint policies, which is, you might say, a special form of open access publishing. So this is just a kind of a random selection of research on open access. And there's a lot going on in this space. And it's not just research, as probably many of you are aware, there's also a lot of policy debating about this. So policymakers at universities, research institutions, at research funders, they spend a lot of time developing policies around open access publishing. And this is also about a lot of money, because this is about many, many millions of euros or dollars that are being spent to fund scientific publishing and also increasingly to fund open access publishing. So how do our own journals, how do they perform in terms of open access publishing? I will start with journals that are kind of specific to science of science, or more specifically to scientometrics, this particular subfield within the broader field of science of science. So you see 6 journals, including my own, so that's why I started by declaring a competing interest. So what you see for these 6 journals is whether or not they enable open access publishing. And the answer is that essentially they all do, but they do it in 2 different ways. So there are a number of journals that are hybrid. So that means that in principle, you need to subscribe to these journals to have access to their content, but at the same time, individual authors may choose to pay an APC and to have their own article openly accessible in their journals, while other articles in the same journal are behind the paywall. And there are also full open access journals where all the articles are openly accessible. I won't go into more detail about that distinction. What is more interesting is actually the differences in the APCs. So the APC is what you pay to have your article openly accessible in a particular journal. So what you can see is that these APCs, they range from US $600 for quantitative science studies, 600 or 800, depending on whether you are a member of a society. That's the lower bound, to over 3,000 US dollars for the Journal of Informatics, the Elsevier journal. So that's a 5-fold difference. So a really, really big difference. Keep that in mind. This is a really, really big difference in terms of how much you pay for publishing in these journals. There's, by the way, one journal for which I was unable to find the APC, which I think is also interesting in itself, that the information cannot even be found on the website of the publisher. Big differences. You might imagine that perhaps some of these journals do provide more services to researchers than other journals, and that could explain these differences in APC rates. I don't think that's the case. So, for instance, when you look at the two extremes, so Journal of Informatics, the Elsevier journal, and QSS, then you see this fivefold difference in APC. I know both journals quite well because I am, as I mentioned, the editor-in-chief of QSS, and I used to be the editor-in-chief of Journal of Informatics, the Elsevier journal. So I know how they operate, and they operate in basically the same way. Actually, QSS, I would argue, is offering more services, services that the Elsevier journal doesn't provide, for instance, English language editing. But nevertheless, for some reason, the Elsevier journal is 5 times as expensive in terms of what you need to pay as an author. I don't think there's any kind of justification in terms of actual costs that are made to provide services to readers. Let's then go to the prestigious journals. The really prestigious journals. So we see APCs ranging from 3,000 for eLife to almost 10,000 for the Nature journals. Nature itself, and also Nature Human Behavior, which of course was also covered yesterday in one of the presentations. So we learned yesterday all the work that Nature is investing, or Nature Human Behavior is investing in the articles they publish. What was not discussed yesterday, but what I'm showing you right now, is also the flip side. So how much you need to pay for this? Almost 10,000 euros for publishing an article, an open access article in Nature Human Behavior. So that's how the system works. This is just one thing. Keep in mind, in particular, these big differences. So when you look at all these journals together, it's a difference that is about more than 10-fold. When you look only at the discipline-specific journals, so the journals in the top row, then it's about a 5-fold difference between the extremes. Okay, next thing, open access, and then the so-called green way of doing open access. That means self-archiving your article in a repository. So the article will appear in a journal, but the journal might be a subscription journal or a hybrid journal, but your article is not openly accessible in the journal. However, the version of the article that was accepted for publication is made openly accessible in a repository. That might be your institutional repository, it might be a preprint repository or something else. But in some way, you as an author have self-archived your accepted article somewhere online in a repository. That's called green open access. Do journals allow you to do this? So in the past, this was something that many journals really didn't like. Journals have to some extent changed their policies. But still, we see that when we look at these journals here, we see that there are big differences. The open access journals, both QSS, but also the Frontiers journals, they say, yes, that's fine. Of course, you can put your accepted article in a repository, no problem. The other journals have so-called embargoes. They say, well, it's okay to do that, but only after 12 months or after 24 months. So these journals don't want you to make your research immediately openly accessible. That's not allowed. So if you don't pay the APC, so your article ends up behind the paywall in the journal, then the alternative way of making it openly accessible, so in a repository, is allowed, but only with a 1-year or 2-year embargo. So that, of course, means that to a large extent, the whole benefit of open access is not really existent anymore with these embargoes. So be aware of what this actually implies. This means that the work that you have done as a researcher, all the intellectual labor you've done, all the efforts you have made to write an article, in the end, you're not allowed to share that, to share the final result with readers, except for those who are able to pay subscription fees, or for those who are willing to wait 1 year or 2 years. Which I think does not really make sense anymore in 2022 with all the possibilities that we have today to disseminate new scientific knowledge. What do the prestigious journals do? A journal like Science actually is quite generous. They say, yes, that's fine. You can make your accepted article open access. It's okay. The Nature journals have an embargo. Actually, it's an embargo that is less restrictive than what you see for the disciplinary journals. It's 6 months for Nature and Nature Human Behavior. Also, PNAS has a 6-month embargo. eLife is fully open access, so for them it's all fine. Okay, so this is so-called green open access. Again, we see the differences between the journals and we see these problematic embargoes. And the question, of course, that we should all ask ourselves is, do we find that acceptable? Do we find it acceptable that our research, the research that we have put so much effort into, the research that could perhaps make a big difference in terms of societal benefits, benefits for the research system, is it acceptable that that research cannot be released except after 6, 12, or 24 months? Okay, open peer review, another element of the open science movement. So that's the idea to make peer review outcomes openly accessible alongside published articles. So that could be the review reports themselves. It can also be the identities of the reviewers or a combination of these two. Again, there's a lot of research into this. So many science researchers study this development. I won't go into the details, but I just want to show you that this is a topic in itself which is attracting quite a lot of attention. And clearly, many kind of benefits have been shown of open peer review. And in particular, it has been shown that almost all researchers, something like 80 or 90%, are in favor of publishing review reports. There are very few research that are opposed to this. So what do the journals do? When you look at the discipline-specific journals, you see that QSS is the only journal that publishes review reports. Only, I must say, for accepted articles, not for articles that are rejected. Frontiers is a journal that publishes the identities of reviewers, but not the actual content of the reviews. That's the opposite of what QSS is doing. The other journals don't publish the peer review report. So you have no insight into what is happening in the peer review process. And essentially, you just need to trust the journals. You need to trust them when they say that they do rigorous, high-quality peer review. The prestigious journals, the science journals, PNAS, they don't make peer review openly available. eLife does make peer review open. They are very progressive. They publish review reports for accepted articles, but also for rejected articles. They say there's value in peer review reports. Also, if your research gets rejected, it's still valuable to make these reports openly available because readers of your work, if it is on a preprint service, readers of your work may benefit from this. So it's important that we share all of that. The Nature journals are also publishing review reports, but only if the authors agree. Okay, next, open data. So to what extent are researchers expected or required to make the data that they use in their research, to make the data openly available? Of course, always subject to certain exceptions for legal reasons, for privacy reasons, for ethical reasons. But in general, are researchers expected to do that? And again, there's a lot of research into this whole topic of data sharing or open data or fair data. So it's an entire area in itself with many researchers, science researchers, studying this whole discussion about openness of data and data sharing. But what do we see for our own journals? At QSS, we recently made data sharing mandatory. The Elsevier journal, Journal of Informatics, is encouraging researchers to share their data. The other journals don't seem to have a policy, at least I couldn't find it. When you look at the prestigious journals, then we see that eLife also makes it mandatory. PNAS and the science journals do that as well. For the Nature journals, I must say I found it a bit hard to really understand what they do because their policy is rather complex, but I think it's optional, data sharing. So again, you see the differences between what the journals do. Some journals say, yes, if we want research to be reproducible, if we want to make sure that we reduce the risk of all kinds of research integrity problems or reproducibility problems, then we need to make data sharing mandatory. Some journals have taken that step. Other journals have not yet done that, or they have only made it optional, or they encourage to do this. Okay, one more, open metadata. So we, as science of science researchers, we of course work a lot with data about scientific publications. Actually, both of the earlier presentations today by Daniel and by Roberta, they both rely partly on data about scientific publications. Traditionally, we use Web of Science or Scopus or perhaps Dimensions. So proprietary databases, we use them for this purpose. But increasingly, we now also have open databases, which is a major development, because it means, first of all, that everyone has access to the data, which means that it's not just researchers that can afford, for instance, to pay for data that can do this type of work, but all researchers can do it. Also those who don't have resources to pay for data. It means that science of science studies research becomes much more reproducible. So we can actually reproduce each other's research, which is typically not possible when you use proprietary data. So there are many reasons why this is an important development. And again, there's a whole kind of community that is working on this, that is studying this phenomenon of openness of what we call metadata of scientific publications, a community that is actually building infrastructures like Open Citation and Open Alex. So lots of things are happening here. But we depend on the journals. The journals need to actually be willing to make this metadata openly available. So let's see, what do the journals do? So in our own field, we see that QSS and also research evaluation, they make complete metadata available. The other journals don't do this. The other journals have missing metadata. So that applies to the Elsevier journal, but also to JASIS, the Wiley journal, and Scientomatics, the Springer Nature journal, and also to the Frontiers journal. So they all make only partial metadata openly available. So for instance, in JASIS, the abstracts are missing, and in Elsevier, the Elsevier journal, abstracts and affiliations are missing. The same for the Scientomatics, the Springer Nature journal. So that means that if you publish in these journals, then what you are doing is you are publishing research for which the metadata will not be made openly available, and essentially you are contributing to sustaining a system in which we need proprietary data sources like Web of Science and Scopus, because these are the only data sources that have comprehensive metadata on scientific publications. And the movement towards openness of all this data is actually slowed down by publishing in these journals that don't make all the metadata openly available. So this was also for myself and for many people in my editorial board at QSS. This was actually the reason why we moved a number of years ago from the Elsevier journal, Journal of Informatics, to QSS, because we were dissatisfied with the lack of openness of metadata for the Elsevier journal, and that's why we decided to start the new QSS journal. So what do the prestigious journal do? Some of them do really well. PNAS, the science journals, and eLife, they do a good job. The Springer Nature journals, so they have the same problem as Scientomatics. So abstracts are missing and affiliations are missing in the metadata. So again, if you publish in these journals, you are essentially contributing to maintaining the status quo in which you need proprietary data sources in order to do science of science studies research based on publication data. So here we see that the choices that we make as researchers to publish in certain journals and not in others actually also affect the way we do science of science research and the way the science of science community itself can and will develop in the future. So these choices that we make, they really matter. I'm going to show you one more thing, and that's prestige, the prestige of our journals. Prestige, of course, it's something that consists of many different things. It's about the people that are behind the journal. It's about the name of a journal, the publisher. A label like Nature, of course, is really a strong brand. But it's also about bibliometric indicators. It's about being indexed in databases like Web of Science and Scopus, and it's about things like impact factors. And that's what I will focus on right now. And again, this is a huge topic in the field of science, in particular in the scientometric subfield. There's a lot of research into this topic. Also at the policy level, this is hugely important. So there's very big discussions about impact factors and the problematic influence they have on how research is evaluated and how they could impede, for instance, progress in implementing open science practices. So there's a lot going on, but what are we doing ourselves as science of science researchers? So these are the discipline-specific journals. So there are two journals, which are the kind of the new entrants in this field, QSS and the Frontiers Journal. They don't have an impact factor. The Frontiers Journal is not even in Web of Science. So if you want to have an impact factor, if you feel that's important for you, then you should not publish in these journals. You should not publish in QSS or in Frontiers. Yes, QSS is the cheapest journal, but it's not the most attractive journal in terms of prestige, at least not if you define prestige in terms of impact factors. So the more expensive journals, like Journal of Informatics, the Elsevier Journal, but also the Wiley and Springer Nature journals, they are the more prestigious ones. Of course, the other journals, they are much more prestigious in terms of impact factor. That's not a surprise. So here you see the numbers. So this is what you get if you publish in these journals, and if impact factor matters to you, and if you consider impact factor to be a measure of prestige, then indeed you should go for these journals. So this is basically the system that we have, and this is the system that we all need to navigate, and where we all need to make decisions. So should we submit our work to Nature, to PNAS, to Nature Human Behavior, or should we go for the discipline-specific journals? And which one should we choose? Should we go for the Elsevier Journal, the Springer Nature Journal, or perhaps a journal like QSS? I'm going to show you what I call the prestige cycle in scientific publishing, which shows the complexity of this landscape, and also, I would say, the perverse social dynamics that we have. We have essentially two types of publishing venues: established high prestige venues and innovative low prestige venues. So I think something like QSS is innovative, but it's low prestige, at least in terms of impact factors. Perhaps not according to other aspects of prestige, but when you look at impact factors or being indexed in the most prominent databases, it's low prestige. Other journals, definitely journals like Nature and Science, but also some of the other journals in our own field, they are more established and higher prestige, at least according to being indexed in databases and having an impact factor. What is the dynamic that we have? Researchers tend to be eager to publish in these high prestige venues, and these low prestige venues, it seems for many researchers, they are kind of second-class venues that you use only if you have no more prestigious options available. So preferably researchers want to publish, many researchers, not everyone, but many researchers, it seems, want to publish in these high prestige venues. Or perhaps, of course, they feel they should publish in these venues because, for instance, that is important for career reasons. What happens? These high prestige venues, they are in the position to choose which research they want to publish, which research they don't want to publish, and they can choose to publish the most sexy research. For the low prestige venues, that's much more difficult because they have less choice, because they get fewer submissions. So they typically focus on publishing sound research, but research that is sound but not necessarily sexy. We saw that the highly prestigious venues, they charge high APCs. In many cases, APCs that are far exceeding the cost of publishing. The low prestige venues, typically, they have low or moderate APCs, still expensive for many researchers, but relatively low, which tend to reflect more or less the cost of publishing, so the actual cost. These high prestige venues, their focus is essentially on maintaining the status quo, because the status quo is quite okay for them. So they have little pressure to innovate. These low prestige venues, they are the ones that want to innovate. And for instance, they want to support open science practices, like data sharing, like open peer review, like open metadata, all these things. What's happening? Researchers have this preference for the high prestige venues. These venues publish in particular the most sexy research that they receive from these researchers. They earn quite a lot of money by doing so. And ultimately, the prestige of these venues will increase even further because they publish this sexy research, which gives them prestige. They publish research from researchers that can afford high APCs, which are likely to be researchers that are affiliated with also prestigious institutions that have money available to pay these APCs. And yeah, the low prestige venues, they will remain at this low level of prestige because they cannot publish this sexy research that attracts a lot of attention because it's published by the high prestige venues. They focus on being innovative, but being innovative doesn't immediately pay off in terms of prestige because, for instance, if you innovate, if you start new journals, you will not get an impact factor, it will take time, or you may not even get an impact factor at all because your journal is not seen as a kind of a legitimate way of publishing scientific work according to the criteria of a database like Web of Science. So we have a feedback loop in which the high prestige publishing venues will become even more prestigious, while the low prestige publishing venues will remain at this low level. At least if this description of the system is more or less accurate, which I think it is to some degree in a kind of approximate sense. Of course, there are many exceptions, and there are many researchers that don't behave exactly in this way, but essentially, more or less, I think this is how the system is operating. What does it mean? What is the bottom line? The high prestige venues, they publish the most sexy research, which probably is also, to some extent, the highest quality research, but at the same time, it is also probably to a significant degree the most overhyped research, or the research that is most questionable in terms of, for instance, research practices. The high prestige venues are able to charge excessive APCs, so APCs that exceed the cost of publishing. So that means that scientific publishing is much more expensive than is actually necessary. And it also means that researchers with limited resources are excluded from publishing in these venues. So they simply cannot participate in this kind of publishing game. And these high prestige venues, they are focused on maintaining the status quo. So they stifle innovation in scientific publishing. All kinds of new ideas about how publishing can be improved, how it can be made more open. These innovative ideas are not really supported by the high prestige venues because essentially they could be a threat to the status quo. That is, I think, quite a problematic and perverse dynamic that we have. What does it all mean for us as science of science researchers? So to conclude, I would like to look at this question from two different perspectives. So first of all, what does it mean for the research that we do? So I think that we have a kind of a task, we as a community, a task to study in detail the problems that I think are most severe and most challenging in the research system. And what I've learned myself is that typically these are the problems that relate to incentive systems, perverse social dynamics, where kind of we all operate in ways that are kind of understandable when you look at individual people or individual organizations, system, what they do. But when you look at the system as a whole, they are undesirable and they yield suboptimal or even deeply problematic outcomes. So this is one of the most challenging problems that we have in science. And what I just showed you, the prestige cycle in scientific publishing, is one prominent example of such a social dynamic that I would say is rather perverse. And we need to study this. We need to develop a rigorous understanding of these social dynamics, and we need to invent creative ways to reshape these dynamics. And that is extremely difficult. Very difficult, but it's also extremely important. So for me, this is actually what I would call the holy grail of science of science. So this is what I think really deserves more attention from our community. But there's more. There's also the question of how we, ourselves, as science of science researchers, how we should do our own research, how we should publish our own research. So based on what I've just shown you, I would like to make a call to all of you, and it also applies to myself, for all of us. We should think carefully about how we publish our research, about our own publishing practices. Should we really go for these prestigious journals? Does it really make sense? Or should we actually think twice? And should we think about what really ultimately is the best thing to do for the science system? And perhaps in a certain way, this is a question about what also your own personal ultimate aim is. Is it about, do you want to become a famous researcher? Is that what this is all about? And then perhaps you should play the prestige game, and it makes perfect sense. It's the right thing to do. If your ultimate motivation is actually not so much to become famous, to become kind of esteemed researcher, but your aim is to contribute to a better research system, then I don't think publishing in these high prestige journals is necessarily the right thing to do. And then perhaps you should think twice and consider some of the other options that I've shown to you. What I also think we can all do, and we should all consider, is to support initiatives for improving scientific publishing. So I'm running some of these initiatives myself. So recently I launched one that is called Publish Your Reviews. I won't go into the details, I don't have time for that, but it's one initiative for improving scientific publishing. This is something we can all support, even if you want to keep publishing in prestigious journals, these journals with their problematic features. Even then, still, you can support an initiative like this to at least make a minor but still meaningful contribution to improving the publishing. So ultimately, I would like to end by just making the point that we, as science of science researchers, more than research in other fields, we have a special responsibility to lead by example. We are the ones that really understand how the science system is working. We are the ones that are kind of full-time thinking about this, thinking about the research system, studying it. And that means that we cannot afford to just say, oh, I will publish in the highest impact factor journal or in the most prestigious journal. That's just the thing I will do because that's what everyone is doing. We have a special responsibility to think more carefully about this and to lead by example. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ludo, for that powerful call to action among ourselves. So let's just give him a round of applause, and please go ahead and mute yourself and ask questions.
Hi, Ludo. How's it going? Yeah, maybe I can start with a question. Yeah, yesterday we were just discussing in the chat with also Dan Laramore that high impact journals, and you also mentioned that they publish perhaps the most questionable papers, and they also have like the higher retraction rates. And I was wondering, to what extent do you think these high retraction rates are due to the visibility of the journal? Because if you publish in Nature and it's like overhyped research or has some kind of flaw, people will scrutinize it much more. If you've published it in Scientometrics, no one cares, because people are not jealous that you publish in Scientometrics, but they are more jealous when you publish in Nature. And I was just wondering if we imagine that prestige is not a driver for our publication activity, if lower impact journals would also be highly visible if they would have high retraction rates. And I was wondering your opinion on this one.
Yeah, what I think you see is indeed a relatively high rate of retractions in high impact journals, which some people argue is evidence of these journals publishing actually relatively low quality research that is likely to be overhyped or likely to be the result of perhaps even misbehavior, or perhaps as Daniel suggested in his talk, research that is kind of the result of some kind of random mistake that someone is making, which gives a kind of unexpected, surprising finding. So I think that partly that argument indeed makes sense. So partly, indeed, I do think that what is published in these prestigious journals is likely to be kind of questionable quality for the reasons that I just mentioned, these mechanisms. At the same time, I think we should not kind of pretend that these journals, that this is the only mechanism that really drives what is published in these journals. Of course, we need to recognize that they also tend to do, in general, quite a rigorous peer review, perhaps more rigorous than some of the less prestigious journals. So it's two mechanisms that are at work at the same time. And it's hard, I think it's really hard to kind of disentangle these two mechanisms. So for me, it's kind of unclear how strong these two mechanisms are. I don't know.
Thank you.
Eric, I believe you were next.
My video's not going. There it goes. Hi, Ludo. Thank you very much for your talk. Just a point I wanted to make on your slide that showed QSS not having an impact factor and how that could possibly make the journal less, maybe not attractive, but to researchers who need an impact factor. In Web of Science, the emerging sources citation index, they announced they're going to start giving impact factors. Do you have a sense of when that could happen, or as editor-in-chief, have you heard any more about that development?
Yes, yeah, that's a good point, Eric. So indeed, they recently announced that starting from next year, so it will be June 2023, they will make available impact factors also for journals like QSS that are in this so-called emerging sources citation index. And which I think is a good development. It's a minor step. It doesn't really solve the bigger problems, but it's a minor step that is nevertheless a good one. And so it will make the kind of the obstacle for kind of new journals to get started and to attract attention, will make the obstacle a little bit smaller. So I'm kind of pleased about that, although it's minor.
Okay, Oscar next.
Hi, Ludo. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very great pleasure to listen to you again. So my question, I have two questions. One is for our group. So we are for the group project, we are looking at the relationship between open access publication and gender and age, academic age. So we need to classify the open access articles into two groups, with a fee and without a fee. So what do you recommend us to, especially for gold ones? You know, gold ones, some are, I think, have APC and some not so. And the second question, I don't know, but the visibility is kind of very big problem for young researchers or academically young researchers like me, not young, but academically young. So what do you recommend for these researchers? Because they don't want to become famous, but they want a job and steady income, something like that. Thank you very much.
Great questions. The first question, so I think what you mean, Özgür, is the distinction between indeed APC-based gold open access versus what is nowadays often called diamond open access, so no fee for the authors. In terms of data sources, my recommendation would be to take a look at the directory of open access journals, where you can find the APCs of open access journals, and if there's no APC, then essentially the journal qualifies as diamond. There's also, by the way, I don't know if you have seen it, but there was recently an interesting contribution, an article by a team from Australia, Lucy Montgomery, about open access publishing in relation to gender. Your second question is, of course, the really difficult issue. So the points that I made are kind of relatively easy for me to say, because I have kind of an established position in the field, and then you can relatively easily say these things like, oh, we shouldn't publish in these journals, we shouldn't play that game. But it's of course not fair to kind of expect people who don't have a secure position in the research system to expect them to apply the same standards in how they make these types of choices. I think here a certain level of pragmatism is needed. It depends a bit, of course, on your personal setting, the evaluation system, the career system you find yourself in that differs between countries. But in many systems, you need to be pragmatic. You need to at least partly play this game. I understand that. And that's also why some of these things that I'm promoting, like this publisher reviews initiative, they kind of accept the rules of the game, because I know you cannot easily change that. But within those rules, they push for kind of small changes in how we do things, so that we can gradually, step by step, change the rules of the game. So some pragmatism is required, I think that means in practice that perhaps you do need to play the game in some cases, but perhaps there are also cases where you can kind of do the thing that you feel is really the best thing for science as a whole, and to promote kind of good practices like open science. Perhaps you can support initiatives that are pushing for this. So for instance, when we had this disagreement a number of years ago with Elsevier about the Journal of Informatics, and we started a new journal, there were hundreds of researchers in the field, hundreds of scientometricians, many of them also early career, that gave their support to this development simply by signing a letter. It's a small thing, signing a letter, but nevertheless, it is helpful actually to put pressure on a publisher and to kind of take such a big step of starting a new journal. So I don't expect everyone to kind of do the most kind of extreme thing, because I know that's unrealistic. But let's all try to be at least aware of all these things and try to do the right thing whenever possible.
Thank you for your question. So let's finish with Mary.
Oh, also my audio. Okay, there I am. Hi. Hi, it's so good to see you. And I have a question from kind of an indexing and full text availability perspective, because I think historically a lot of the reason that these journals got to be high impact is because they were included in key indexes. And back in the print era, libraries would go through key indexes, like for instance, Wilson's Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, and they just subscribed to journals on the index. So it kind of created a system where, because it was indexed, then it became, you know, a journal that was widely available and widely read. You know, it kind of became a cycle. Would you agree with that in general, historically speaking?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that, and also have background as an electronic resources management. And when we saw a lot of journals, you know, the emerging open access movement, it was very tricky to have the full text available and included in the library discovery systems. You know, with the common indexes, the discoverability of the full text was pretty seamless, but then we just had the directory of open access journals, which caused you to go like 3 clicks down to find the full text necessarily, or redo your search on that other platform. So I guess I feel like that's sort of like the root of the tree that we're studying the branches of, so to speak. And I wonder if you see, I do think that increased discoverability will improve this, but a lot of research, I know my question is going through a lot of different tracks here, there are a lot of loose ends, but a lot of researchers I know, they go to Google Scholar and they try to find the full text through Google Scholar, but the Google Scholar index, you know, it's, we know I think there's some issues there, but to what degree do you think just increased availability or increased indexing itself of these other modes of scholarly communication will level the playing field over time? And what mechanisms do you think might facilitate that? Would it be improved standards like from NISO? Would it be something else? I just think historically the issue of the pre-internet full text indexing, you know, system and subscription system is sort of like the foundation that this is all built on. And I just wonder what you think in the future could, you know, level the playing field. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Mary, that's a great question. Well, first of all, that first point that you made is something I really agree with. So the kind of, we have a dynamic in which the databases that we happen to be working with, they make choices to include certain things, not to include other things, and that kind of creates a system that is self-reinforcing. So also databases like Web of Science and Scopus, they do that. It creates a big divide between being in the database and being outside the database. And that is creating a big obstacle for new entrants in the system, so new journals that get started, or even more radical innovations. Because of course you can also question whether we still need journals in the traditional sense, or whether there are alternative ways of organizing publishing, but that's definitely something that would be incompatible with the way in which these databases work, and that therefore would be very hard to get kind of successfully introduced into the system. So these databases and their indexing policies, they have lots of problematic effects. What we need, I think, is well, I should first say I'm not an expert on kind of library systems. I think you have much more knowledge about that than I do. But I do think that what we need is all stakeholders in the system to take kind of responsibility for what they do. So now in this talk, I made a kind of a call on all of you and myself and our community to do the right thing. So that's our own responsibility as researchers. Publishers have a responsibility to do the right thing, and they don't always do that. They can and they should do better. But there's another actor in the system that has a responsibility, and that's institutions and funders. And they have a responsibility to think more carefully about their role in building infrastructures and maintaining certain types of infrastructures. And I think at the moment they don't have sufficient awareness, although it is gradually improving, but they don't have sufficient awareness of the role they can and they should play in that landscape. And it's really crucial that they become more aware of the powerful role they could play by setting up the right infrastructures to make it much easier to innovate, to start new journals, to move towards more open science compatible ways of working. And it's sometimes really sad, from my point of view, really sad to see organizations that are actually quite powerful in terms of the amount of funds they have, and they can spend just kind of doing things that essentially more or less maintain the status quo, while they could actually do much more valuable things with these same funds, in particular by making the right infrastructure investments.
Thank you.